The February 26 incident was an attempted coup d'etat in Japan on the 26th of February 1936. It was organized by a group of young Imperial Japanese Army officers with the goal of purging the government and military leadership of the factional rivals and ideological opponents. Although the rebels succeeded in assassinating several leading officials and in occupying the government center of Tokyo, they failed to assassinate Prime Minister Keisuke Okada or secure control of the Imperial Palace. The supporters in the army made attempts to capitalize on their actions, but divisions within the military, combined with imperial anger at the coup, meant they were unable to achieve a change of government. Facing overwhelming opposition as the army moved against them, the rebels surrendered on the 29th of February. Unlike earlier examples of political violence by young officers, the coup attempt had severe consequences. After a series of closed trials, 19 of the uprising's leaders were executed for mutiny and another 40 imprisoned. A radical Kodoha faction lost its influence within the army. The period of government by assassination came to a close, and the military increased its control over the civilian government. Background: Army factional rivalry. The Imperial Japanese Army had a long history of factionalism among its high-ranking officers, originally stemming from domainal rivalries in the Meiji period. By the early 1930s, officers in the high command had become split into two main informal groups: the Kodoha Imperial Way faction led by Gen. Araki Sadao and his ally Gen. Jinsaburo Mizaki, and the Toseiha Control faction identified with Gen. Tetsuzan Nagata. The Kodoha emphasized the importance of Japanese culture, spiritual purity over material quality, and the need to attack the Soviet Union, while the Toseiha officers, who were strongly influenced by the ideas of the contemporary German General Staff, supported central economic and military planning, technological modernization, mechanization and expansion within China. The Kodoha was dominant in the army during Araki's tenure as Minister of War from 1931 to 34, occupying most significant staff positions, but many of its members were replaced by Toseiha officers following Araki's resignation. The young officers, army officers, were divided between those whose education had ended at the Army Academy and those who had advanced on to the prestigious Army War College. The latter group formed the elite of the officer corps, while officers of the former group were effectively barred by tradition from advancement to staff positions. A number of these lesser privileged officers formed the Army's contribution to the young, highly politicized group often referred to as the Young Officers. The Young Officers believed that the problems facing the nation were the result of Japan straying from the Kokutai. The privileged classes exploited the people, leading to widespread poverty in rural areas, and deceived the emperor, usurping his power and weakening Japan. The solution, they believed, was a Showa restoration, modeled on the Meiji Restoration of 70 years earlier. By rising up and destroying the evil advisors around the throne, the officers would enable the emperor to re-establish his authority. The emperor would then purge Western ideas and those who exploited the people, restoring prosperity to the nation. These beliefs were strongly influenced by contemporary nationalist thought, especially the political philosophy of the former socialist Ikikita. The loose-knit group varied in size, but is estimated to have had roughly 100 regular members, mostly officers in the Tokyo area. Its informal leader was Mitsugi Nishida. Nishida, a former army lieutenant and disciple of Kita, had become a prominent member of the civilian nationalist societies that proliferated from the late 1920s. He referred to the army group as the Kokutai Genri-ha faction, involved at least to some extent in most of the political violence of the period following the March and October incidents of 1931. The Army and Navy members of the group split and largely ended their association with civilian nationalists. Despite its relatively small size, the faction was influential, due in no small part to the threat it posed. It had sympathizers among the general staff and imperial family, most notably Prince Chichibu, the emperor's brother, who was friends with Nishida and other Kokutai Genri leaders. Despite being fiercely anti-capitalist, it had also managed to secure irregular funding from Zaibatsu leaders who hoped to shield themselves. The exact nature of the relationship between the Kodoha and the Kokutai Genri is complicated. The two factions are often treated as the same or as two groups forming a larger whole. Contemporary accounts and the writings of members of the two groups make clear they were actually distinct groups in a mutually beneficial alliance. However, the Kodoha shielded the Kokutai Genri and provided it with access, while they in exchange benefited from the perceived ability to restrain the radical officers. Political violence. The years leading up to the February 26 incident were marked by a series of outbursts of violence by the young officers and the fellow nationalists against the political opponents. Most notable was the May 15 incident of 1932, in which young naval officers assassinated Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi. This incident is significant because it convinced the young army officers of the need to utilize troops in any potential coup attempt. The ringleaders of the incident, as in the previous March and October incidents, received relatively light punishments. The direct prelude to the coup, however, was the 1934 Military Academy incident and its consequences. In this incident, Captain Takahashi Muranaka and Captain Asahi Aizawa, prominent members of the Kokutai Genri, were arrested for planning a coup with a group of military cadets. Muranaka and Aizawa admitted discussing such a coup, but denied having any plans to actually carry it out. The military court investigating the incident found there was insufficient evidence to indict, but Muranaka and Aizawa were suspended by the army. The two were convinced that the incident was a Toseiha attack on the young officers and began circulating a pamphlet calling for a house cleaning of the army and naming Nagata as the chief villain. They were then expelled from the army. It was at this time that the last Kodoha officer in a prominent position, Gen. Mizaki, was forced from office. The young officers were enraged by his removal because, having become disillusioned with Araki for his failures to overcome resistance in the cabinet during his time as war minister, Mizaki had become the focus of their hopes. Muranaka and Aizawa released a new pamphlet attacking Nagata for the dismissal, as did Nishida. On 12 August 1935, in the Aizawa incident, Lt. Colonel Saburo Aizawa, a member of the Kokutai Genri and a friend of Mizaki, murdered Nagata in his office in retaliation. Aizawa's public trial became a media sensation, as Aizawa and the Kokutai Genri leadership, in collusion with the judges, turned it into a soapbox from which their ideology could be broadcast. Aizawa's supporters in the mass media praised his morality and patriotism, and Aizawa himself came to be seen as a simple soldier who sought only to reform the army and the nation according to the true national principle. Preparations. Deciding to act, the Kokutai Genri had long supported a violent uprising against the government. The decision to finally act in February 1936 was caused by two factors. The first was the decision announced in December 1935 to transfer the 1st Division, to which most of the Kokutai Genri offices belong, to Manchuria in the spring. This meant that if the officers did not strike before then, any possible action would be delayed by years. The second was Aizawa's trial. The impact of his actions had impressed the officers, and they believed that by acting while his trial was still going on, they could take advantage of the favorable public opinion it was engendering. The decision to act was initially opposed by Nishida and Kita when they learned of it. The pair's relationship with most of the officers had become relatively distant in the years leading up to the uprising, and they were against direct action. However, once it was clear that the officers were determined to act anyway, they moved to support them. Another barrier to be overcome was opposition to the involvement of troops from Terrazo Ando, who had sworn an oath to his commander not to involve his men in any direct action. Ando's position in the 3rd Infantry Regiment was essential to the plot, so Muranaka and Nonaka spoke with him repeatedly, ultimately wearing down his resistance. February 26 was chosen because the officers had been able to arrange to have themselves and their allies serve as duty officers on the date, facilitating their access to arms and ammunition. The date also allowed Mizaki to testify at Aizawa's trial as scheduled on the 25th. Planning and manifesto. The uprising was planned in a series of meetings held between 18 to 22 February by Mitsugi Nishida, Yasuhide Kurihara, Terrazo Ando, Hisashi Kono, Takahashi Muranaka and Asaichi Isabi. The plan decided upon was relatively simple. The officers would assassinate the most prominent enemies of the Kokutai, secure control of the administrative center of the capital and the Imperial Palace, then submit their demands. They had no longer-term goals, believing that those should be left to the emperor. It is believed that they were prepared to replace Hirohito with Prince Chichibu if necessary. However, the young officers believed they had at least tacit approval for their uprising from a number of important army officers after making a number of informal approaches. These included Minister of War Yoshiyuki Kawashima, Araki Mizaki, Tomoyuki Yamashita, Kanji Ishiwara, Shigeru Honjo and their own immediate commanders, Ko Hikashi and Takeo Hori. Kawashima's successor as Minister of War later remarked that if all the officers who had supported the rebels had been forced to resign, there wouldn't have been enough high-ranking officers left to replace them. They prepared an explanation of their intentions and grievances in a document entitled Manifesto of the Uprising, which they wanted to be handed to the emperor. The document was prepared by Muranaka, but written in Shiro Nonaka's name as he was the highest-ranking officer involved in the plot. The document was entirely in line with Kokutai Genriha ideals, blaming the Genro, political leaders, military factions, zaibatsu, bureaucrats and political parties for endangering the Kokutai through the selfishness and disrespect for the emperor and asserting the need for direct action. Now, as we are faced with great emergencies both foreign and domestic, if we do not execute the disloyal and unrighteous who threaten the Kokutai, if we do not cut away the villains who obstruct the emperor's authority, who block the restoration, the imperial plan for our nation will come to nothing. To cut away the evil ministers and military factions near the emperor and destroy their heart, that is our duty and we will complete it. 7 targets were chosen for assassination for threatening the Kokutai. The first 4 mentioned in the above list survived the attempted coup. Sanji, Sato, Suzuki and Makino were targeted because they were the most influential imperial advisors. Okada and Takahashi were moderate political leaders who had worked to restrain the military. Finally, Watanabe was targeted as a member of the Tosei Harem because he had been involved with Misaki's removal. Sanji's name was ultimately removed from the list, though the reasons why are disputed. Some of the officer's allies argued that he should be left alive to be used to help convince the emperor to appoint Misaki as prime minister, and this is commonly given as the reason. However, Aizawa testified later that he had rejected these suggestions and continued to make arrangements for the attack on Sanji. According to his account, the attack was only cancelled after the officers assigned to carry it out could not agree over the use of cadets in the operation. The Righteous Army. From the 22nd on, the 7 leaders managed to convince 18 other officers to join the uprising with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Non-commissioned officers were informed on the night of the 25th, hours before the attacks started. Although the officers insisted that all NCOs participated voluntarily and any orders given were merely pro forma, many of the NCOs argued later that they had been in no real position to refuse to participate. The soldiers themselves, 70% of whom were less than a month out of basic training, were not told anything before the coup began, though many were enthusiastic once the uprising began. The bulk of the army was made up of men from the 1st Division's 1st Infantry Regiment and 3rd Infantry Regiment. The only other significant contribution was 138 men from the 3rd Imperial Guard Regiment, including officers, civilians and men from other units. The total size of the Righteous Army was 1,558 men. An official count of 1,483 was given at the time. This number excludes the 75 men who participated in Takahashi's attempt to secure the palace. The leadership adopted the name Righteous Army for this force and the password "Revere the Emperor, Destroy the Traitors," adopted from the Meiji Restoration-era slogan, "Revere the Emperor, Destroy the Shogunate." Allies were also to display a 3-sen postage stamp when approaching the army's lines. Uprising. It snowed heavily on the night of the 25th, covering Tokyo. This heartened the rebel officers because it reminded them of the 1860 Sakura Amon incident in which Ishii assassinated Inosuke, the chief advisor to the shogun, in the name of the emperor. Rebel troops, divided into 6 groups, assembled the troops and left the barracks between 3:30 and 4 o'clock. The attacks on Okada, Takahashi, Suzuki, Sato, the Ministry of War and Police headquarters occurred simultaneously at 5 o'clock. 1st Infantry Regiment, Okada Keisuke. The attack on Okada consisted of 280 men from the 1st Infantry Regiment led by 1st Lt. Jasu hired Kurihara. The troops surrounded the Prime Minister's residence and forced its guards to open the gates. Upon entering the compound and attempting to find the Prime Minister, however, they were fired upon by 4 policemen. All 4 were killed after wounding 6 of the rebel soldiers, but the gunfire succeeded in warning Okada of the danger. He was spirited into hiding by his brother-in-law, Col. Denzo Matsuo, who was said to have resembled Okada, was then discovered and killed by the troops. The soldiers compared Matsuo's wounded face to a picture of the Prime Minister and concluded that they had succeeded in the mission. Okada would escape the next day, but this fact was kept a secret and he played no further role in the incident. After Matsuo's death, Kurihara's men assumed guard positions around the compound. They were joined by 60 men from the 3rd Imperial Guard. Seizure of the Ministry of War. Kiyosada Koda, accompanied by Muranaka Aizawa and others, led 160 men to seize control of the Minister of War's residence, the Ministry of War itself and the General Staff Office. Once this had been accomplished, they entered the residence and asked to see Minister of War Yoshiyuki Kawashima. When they were admitted wanted to see him at 6:30. They read the manifesto aloud and handed him a document in which they made numerous demands of the army, including the rapid resolution of the situation by Kawashima in a way that advanced the cause of the restoration, the prevention of the use of force against the righteous army, the arrest of Kazushige Ugaki, Jiro Minami, Kuniakiko Isa and Yoshitsugu Tatikawa for being the source of the destruction of military command, the immediate dismissal of Lt. Colonel Akira Muto, Col. Hiroshi Nemoto, Amaj. Tadashi Katakura from the army for promoting factionalism, the appointment of Araki as the new commander of the Kwantung Army. As Minister of War, Ugaki had overseen a reduction in size and modernization of the army. He had also failed to back the March incident plotters. Minami, Muto, Nemoto and Katakura were all prominent members of the Toseiha faction. Katakura was also partly responsible for reporting the military academy incident, when Isabi encountered him outside the Ministry of War later that morning. He shot him in the head. During this period, a number of officers sympathetic to the rebels were admitted, including Gen. Mizaki, Gen. Tomoyuki Yamashita, Gen. Usato and the Vice Minister of War, Motu Furusho. Sato praised the young officer's spirit and urged Kawashima to accept the demands. Shortly before 9 o'clock, Kawashima stated that he needed to speak with the emperor and left for the palace. Makino Nobuaki Captain Hisashi Kono commanded a team consisting of 7 members, including 6 civilians, to attack Makino, who was staying at Kofuso, part of the Rio Kanitoya in Yugawara with his family. Arriving at 5:45, they stationed 2 men outside, then entered the inn with weapons drawn, at which point policemen stationed inside opened fire, beginning a lengthy gunfight. A policeman notified Makino and his party of the attack and led them to a rear entrance. The assassins fired upon the group as they left, but did not realize that Makino had managed to escape. Kono was wounded in the chest during the gunfire and one policeman, Yoshitaka Managawa, was killed. As Kono was carried from the fighting, the assassins set fire to the building. Hearing a single shot, Kono believed Makino had shot himself inside the burning building. The men took Kono to a nearby military hospital where all were arrested by military police. Attack on the Asahi Shimbun. At approximately 10 o'clock, Kurihara and Takahashi boarded 3 trucks with 60 men and traveled from the Prime Minister's residence to the offices of the Tokyo Asahi Shimbun, a prominent liberal newspaper. Charging into the building, the officers forced the newspaper employees to evacuate while yelling that the attack was divine retribution for being an un-Japanese newspaper. They then overturned and scattered the newspaper's type trays on the floor, temporarily preventing the newspaper from publishing. Following the attack, the men distributed copies of the uprising's manifesto to nearby newspapers and returned to the Prime Minister's residence. 3rd Imperial Guard Takahashi Kurikyo 1st Lt. Motowaki Takahashi of the 3rd Imperial Guard assembled 120 men and, telling his commanders that they were going to pay the respects at Yasukuni Shrine, marched to Takahashi's personal residence. There he split his men in half and took one group to attack the residence while having the other stand guard outside. After the men smashed the way into the compound, confused servants led Takahashi and Lt. Kanshi Nakajima to Takahashi's bedroom. Then Takahashi shot the sleeping Takahashi with his pistol while Nakajima slashed him with his sword. Takahashi died without waking. Once Takahashi was dead, Takahashi sent the group that had participated in the attack to join the troops already at the Prime Minister's residence. He then accompanied the remaining group of men onward to the palace. Attempt to secure the Imperial Palace. Takahashi and his 75 men entered the palace grounds using the Western Hanzo Gate at 6 o'clock. Takahashi's unit was the scheduled emergency relief company, and he told the commander of the palace guard, Marge Kentaro Honma, that he had been dispatched to reinforce the gates because of the attacks earlier that morning. Honma had been informed of the attacks, so he found Takahashi's arrival unsurprising. Takahashi was assigned to help secure the Sakashita Gate, the main entrance to the grounds directly in front of the Kyuden. Takahashi's plan had been to secure the Sakashita Gate, then use flashlights to signal the nearby rebel troops at police headquarters to join him. Having gained control over access to the Emperor, the rebels would then be able to prevent anyone but Honjo and others they approved of from seeing him. Takahashi had difficulty contacting his allies, however, and by 8 o'clock Honma had learned of his involvement in the uprising. Takahashi was ordered at gunpoint to leave the palace grounds. He did so, joining Kurihara at the Prime Minister's residence. His soldiers remained at the gate until they were relieved at 1300, at which point they returned to the barracks. For this reason, these 75 soldiers were not included in the government's official tally of rebel forces. 3rd Infantry Regiment Sato Makoto 1st LT. Naoshi Sakai led 120 men from the 3rd Infantry Regiment to Saito's private residence in Yotsuya. A group of the soldiers surrounded the policemen on guard and they surrendered. 5 men including Sakai entered the residence and found Sato and his wife Haruko on the 2nd floor in the bedroom. They shot Sato, who fell to the ground dead. His wife covered him with her body and told the soldiers to "please kill me instead." Quote, they pulled her off and continued to fire at Sato. Haruko was wounded by a stray bullet. Following Saito's death, 2 officers led a group of men to attack Gen. Watanabe. The rest left to assume a position northeast of the Ministry of War. Suzuki Kantaro Captain Teruzo Ando led 200 men of the 3rd Infantry Regiment to Suzuki's private residence just across from the Imperial Palace in Kojimachi. They surrounded and disarmed the police on guard. Then a group entered the building. After Suzuki was discovered in his bedroom, he was shot twice. Ando then moved to deliver a coup de grace with his sword. When Suzuki's wife pleaded to be allowed to do it herself, believing Suzuki to be mortally wounded, Ando agreed. He apologized to her, explaining that it was done for the sake of the nation. He then ordered his men to salute Suzuki and they left to guard the Miyake-Zaka Junction north of the Ministry of War. Suzuki, although seriously wounded, would survive. Ando had visited Suzuki at his home in 1934 to suggest that Araki be appointed Prime Minister following Saito's resignation. Suzuki had rejected the suggestion, but Ando had come away with a favorable impression of Suzuki. Watanabe Jotaro. Following the attack on Saito, 20 men led by 2nd LT. Taro Takahashi and 2nd LT. Yutaka Yasuda boarded 2 trucks and headed to Watanabe's residence in Ogakubo on the outskirts of Tokyo, arriving shortly after 7 o'clock. Despite the 2 hours that had passed since the other attacks, no attempt had been made to warn Watanabe. As the men attempted to enter the front of the residence, they were fired upon by military police stationed inside. Yasuda and another soldier were wounded. The soldiers then forced the way in through the rear entrance, where they encountered Watanabe's wife standing outside the bedroom on the 2nd floor. Shoving her aside, they found Watanabe using a futon for cover. Watanabe opened fire with his pistol, whereupon one of the soldiers fired a burst at him with a light machine gun. Takahashi then rushed forward and stabbed Watanabe with his sword. His 9-year-old daughter Kazuko witnessed his death as she hid behind a table nearby. The soldiers then boarded the trucks and left, taking the two wounded to a hospital, then assuming a position in northern Nagatacho, Tokyo Metropolitan Police Headquarters. Captain Shiro Nonaka took nearly a third of all the rebels' troops, 500 men from the 3rd Infantry Regiment, to attack police headquarters, located directly south of the Imperial Palace, with the goal of securing its communication equipment and preventing the dispatch of the police's special security force. They met no resistance and soon secured the building, possibly due to a police decision to leave the situation in the hands of the army. The large number of troops involved was because of the intended move onto the palace itself. After the occupation of police headquarters, 2nd LT, Kinjiro Suzuki led small group to attack the nearby residence of Fumio Goto, the Home Minister. Goto was not home, however, and escaped the attack. This attack appears to have been the result of an independent decision by Suzuki rather than part of the office's overall plan. However,